Telephony technologies. Telephony is the term that we use to talk about telephones. It's the fancy term. Start off with these old-fashioned phones here. Actually, what I want to talk about here for just a second is how this telephone. This was what I'm showing you here was phone phreaking they used to do. In other words, long-distance calls used to be expensive. You had to pay for them separately. You don't anymore. But I want to go back and talk about some of the things that happened before we got to where we are today. Okay, Public Switched Telephone Network, PSTN, which was a traditional telephone network with copper wires, used for many, many, many years. These phones all sort of show that. Then we eventually got to the cellular telephone, and it was a network of cell sites that provided mobile phone service. Now, I just jumped up about 100 years ago. Now, typically today we use voice over IP, which is called VoIP. It allows for us to have voice calls over the internet. So anytime you use, for example, WhatsApp or mostly Skype, any technology that you use to make phone calls over the internet, you're using VoIP. U of L uses it as their main way of their phones to function. So this man here, Alexander Graham Bell, is given credit for inventing the telephone. He was working on the telegraph at the time. Seems like his sister was hard of hearing or something like that. And he was trying to come up with a device that would use sound and not just text, which is what the telegraph used. He was from Scotland, but he worked in the United States. And he was an inventor. He didn't just invent the telephone, he invented other things. For example, he invented x-rays. So he was not a businessman. Keep that in mind. Now this guy, Elisha Gray, was also inventing the telephone. We talk about patents and we talk about copyrights and all that. Well, what happened in this case was Alexander Graham Bell got to the patent office first. So he got the patent, so he got the telephone. And then because he wasn't a businessman, he hooked up with a guy named Theodore Vail. Theodore Vail basically started AT&T, American Telegraph and Telephone. What Vail did was he secured a monopoly on telephones and telephone equipment by basically every time a new company would come around, he'd buy it. He just bought them all up so that he owned everything. There were still a few that he didn't own, but for the most part, he owned almost all of them. Here you can see that the U.S. phone bill in 2025, last year, was about $141. In the old days, back in the 1980s, it was about $83 a month. The breakdown there was $36. This is roughly how phone service can break down now. $36 for local service, $12 for long distance, $25 for wireless. Back in the old days, we didn't have the wireless, but we did have local service and long distance service. You had to pay for all your phone calls. You got to $83 because every time you made a long distance call, you had to pay for it separately. So now we have wireless, and you can get deals for wireless anywhere from $25 to, I don't know, $100 a month, whatever you're looking for. There's all kinds of deals on wireless telegraphy. Okay, how about this penetration? Well, 78% of the people over 10 years old in the United States worldwide, have a phone. But 95% of the adults in the United States have phones. 95% of the adults in the U.S. have phones. There's an example of the evolution of the phones. You see in the 1880s, very bizarre looking device that you use for a telephone. Of course, it was only invented in the 1870s, so it had been around so long. See the 1940s, a two-piece, and into the 60s where you got the dial, where you could dial the phone. In the 80s, you started using more like just digital pressing numbers instead of having to dial. Still using analog technology, but it was, you were able to just press numbers instead of having to dial. And you can see from the 1900s, 2000s, a variety of cell phones came out. Many of them were not really smartphones, but they were cell phones, and you could make phone calls with them. 2010s, 2007, of course, is when the iPhone was invented. And now we're in the 2020s, and we have real smartphones, and there's all kinds of things they can do. So the phone has changed in appearance substantially over the years. So we have from 1876, which is about when it was invented, to 1988, over 100 years, plain old telephone service was the main way we talk on the telephone. That's what they call POTS, P-O-T-S. The digital telegraphy started with the phone companies using it internally before they opened it up to the public. Now we have voice over the internet protocol, which is VoIP, which is the standard today, and no telling what we'll have in 2 years. Okay, here is a diagram that shows how this works. The traditional phone, local telephone service. We had this fiber to feeder. All lines go to the fiber remote terminal and then to the central office. So you can see that we have the houses here. Still, if you have a telephone drop, just like I talked about in cable TV, you have a drop. If you have cable, and anymore, your telephone and your cable usually hooked up together. Okay, so so it's distributed throughout wherever, the neighborhoods and businesses, wherever. There's a distribution cable. There's a splice case where if the case have to splice into it to cut off into another direction. That's a distribution cable here that's distributing things. We have an access terminal here, which will then break the distribution cable, in this case, into 3 parts. It'll break it into more than that if it needs to. And then we'll get the drop into your house. That's how it works. And then that goes all the way back to what they call the central office. There's usually more than one central office in a city, but they always call wherever the cable is going back to, the distribution cable is going back to, is called central office. Okay, so I think I'll stop here for a minute, give you time to relax, and I will come back with a different video. We'll start talking about AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. So we're going to stop right here for right now.